Hi everyone, I'm Russell Leidick. I'm here to tell you about an exciting new development in signal processing which could hugely accelerate a wide variety of scientific computing endeavors. This presentation focuses on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, otherwise known as SETI, simply because it's one of the most interesting computational problems out there. However, I think you'll understand how it would apply to other areas as well. So what you see here is a photo of the radio dish at Stanford University in 2000. If you look carefully, you can see a person walking in the lower left. It gives us a metaphorical sense of just how daunting this problem of alien communication actually is, even if it's theoretically possible. But even if we fail, the methods we develop in the process hold great promise for other areas of science as well. With that, let's get started. First of all, you won't need too much in the way of visuals, so feel free to play this as a podcast while you're on the road. I'm going to go over all the bullet points for you, so all you have to do is tune in. So first, let's focus on SETI. What's the problem? The SETI at Home screensaver has over 100,000 CPUs at its disposal, each of which being available in theory to spend some time crunching on snippets of radio data in search of what might be a signal from ET. Now don't get me wrong, citizen science is great, but it's limited by the number of citizens. Look, this is all going to hit a brick wall when the square kilometer array comes online between now and 2030. By that time, it may need more than all the internet bandwidth in the world here in 2017. The other problem that SETI faces is universal among science projects in which more data is available than processing power to analyze it. We always need to build a custom front-end filter to eliminate all the uninteresting information. After all, we don't want to waste precious core hours studying information that won't lead to any better understanding of the world. In order to cut down on the data burden, scientists expend a huge amount of time writing those front ends. We need a different one from every class of problem. One for ET, one for fast radio burst, one for gravity waves, etc., and that's just for astronomy. Wouldn't it be great if we could replace all that with one common front end which worked for a wide variety of applications and could be rapidly tuned to perform efficiently? That would save all those programming hours for the back-end system that analyzes data sets which we've already deemed to be interesting. Look, hey, let's delete 99% of the data at the source. For SETI, that would mean deleting almost all of it as soon as it hit the radio dish. Well, okay, perhaps we could still save it, but at least we could put it in a giant box labeled boring stuff. So the conventional way to determine whether or not a given signal is interesting is by use of so-called decomposition transforms such as Fourier transforms, wavelets, wave atoms, curvelets, etc. The idea is that by decomposing a data set into a set of orthogonal components such as sine waves or Haar wavelets, we could easily identify anomalies such as a loud ringing due to radio interference, for example. For the most part, this works just fine. The problem is computational complexity. Ostensibly, such transforms are O n log n, meaning that the cost of processing n samples is proportional to n log n. But I say ostensibly because in practice it's quite a bit worse. The reason is that these transforms tend to exercise the memory controller in nonlinear ways, leading to further performance degradation. In a few years, this just isn't going to cut it. Sure, in theory, we could just spend lots more money on GPUs and emit lots more CO2, but SETI would be better off spending its limited financial resources paying scientists to improve the sensitivity and efficiency of the whole system. To that end, we now have this handy tool called an entropy transform. All right, so what is an entropy transform? It's a fast technique for finding bursts of anomalous data, finding signals similar to a reference, or classifying signals. This can occur in any number of dimensions, although radio data from a single dish is basically one-dimensional because it simply samples the electric field amplitude at a periodic interval. The field itself is conveyed as a complex number. So check out my white paper, Introduction to Entropy Transforms. I published it on vixra.com, which is not peer-reviewed, but a computer checked the math and thus far it looks correct. I feel it's better to get things done and let everyone test out the technology than to waste months and months trying to get published in a peer-reviewed journal, only to have the final publication paywalled and ignored. But does it really work? Well, first of all, this technique has been tried before, albeit in very specialized implementations. For example, it's been used to analyze brainwaves and to detect anomalous network traffic. You can find all the published research on the internet. My goal here is to formalize these methods for generic application. So, for example, a so-called exoelasticity transform revealed a 2400 sample, minimum amplitude, simulated extraterrestrial signal injected into real SETI data with GPS interference. Now, of course, our world is bathed in constant GPS broadcasts, so this is a realistic radio interference test case. Now, don't worry about what exoelasticity means. That's all explained in the paper. Suffice to say that it's an entropy transform which looks for a subset of the data which looks most unlike the rest of the data. So how did I determine this? Well, in a moment, I'll show you where to find the source code so you can try it yourself. But let me first summarize the experiment. Several entropy transforms were graded on the fraction of the signal that they identified, which consisted in this case of just 2,400 samples buried in 16 million uninteresting samples. The 50% success point of exoelasticity involved about 3 times as many samples as optimally targeted Fourier analysis, that is about 2,400 samples versus about 800 for the Fourier. Well, now, wait a minute. Why would we want to use a signal detection method that's only 1/3 as sensitive as the Fourier analysis that we already have? Well, first of all, because we could analyze 10 or 100 times as much data with the same computer power. But secondly, because in most cases, it's equally sensitive. You see, if the signal is long enough, like thousands of samples, then most any method would probably find it. On the other hand, if it's too short, like tens of samples, then no method would likely find it. Now, you might get somewhere with compressed sensing techniques such as L1 norm minimization, but that would be many times as expensive as a Fourier transform, so it would defeat the purpose. In any case, on a practical level, we're unlikely to learn much from so few samples anyway. So for all practical purposes, entropy transforms have equivalent sensitivity to decomposition transforms. Actually, they're more sensitive in the generalized sense that they aren't looking for any specific waveform. They're just looking for anomalous behavior. This could go a long way with respect to SETI detection, as we hardly have a clue what an ET signal might look like. In particular, entropy transforms are sensitive to ultra-short pulses scattered aperiodically throughout the data. Decomposition transforms generally are not. Now, what we seek blinds us. In other words, having tunnel vision in science can cause us to miss anomalies which might revolutionize our understanding of the universe. Front-end filtering pipelines, which only look for one class of signal, reinforce this tunnel vision. This is why, for example, human eyes were required to identify Tabby's star, the famous star which blinks on and off at random intervals, sort of like a light bulb. This behavior is so abnormal that software looking for exoplanet transits failed to detect it. Here you can see a light curve showing how the brightness of this star varied erratically back in 2011. Had this been passed through an entropy transform, it would have sent alarm bells ringing. To be sure, it isn't a curve typical of an exoplanet transiting its host star. However, it should have been placed in a box labeled "Weird Stuff for Further Analysis." I wonder how many other anomalies exist in our mountains of scientific data which have been discarded for similarly myopic reasons. So I think it's time to fix our approach to front-end filtering. And yes, there's an app for that. Well, okay, it's more like a command line utility for Linux, Mac, and Windows. The Agnentro open source toolkit is available for free on GitHub. For all the links and documentation you need, visit agnentropy.blogspot.com. It processes up to 1 gigabyte a second, depending on the parameters, after subtracting for the time it takes to read from storage. The included SETI demo utility, by the way, was used to determine the 1/3 sensitivity approximation. It also allows you to test how various entropy transforms behave when a weak signal is injected into a raw SETI data file of your choice. But it doesn't just work for SETI signals. It includes Agnentro Find, which can perform binary searches for approximate matches, as well as exact matches. Just download the software, then type make Agnentro Find, and then run temp/Agnentro Find, and follow the instructions displayed. It can find similar anything, such as uncompressed photos, polymorphic malware, DNA sequences, financial transactions, etc. Depending on the particular data set, some pre-processing may be required for scale normalization. So for instance, it has built-in support for sample differencing, which I call deltification, as well as entropy normalization for scale-agnostic comparisons of diverse data sets. So what can Agnentro Find actually do? Well, I tried using it on some uncompressed photos in my album. So given one photo of my cat, it found the most similar other photo in that album, which is almost 3,000 images. And these are a wide variety of images of people, places, and things. So given one photo of downtown skyscrapers, it found several other photos in the same city and also in other cities, but still downtowns. Given one photo of a golf course, it found other photos of the same golf course, along with photos with similar trees and grass in the same city. Perhaps this is because certain species of trees have distinctive chromaticity histograms. Anyway, note that this will not work with compressed images such as JPEGs that your camera produces. You would have to decompress them into a raw format such as Targa first. But you also get EgnentroScan, a fully functional, open-source entropy transforming front end for free. Use it to find all manner of anomalies in your deluge of data. You can build it with make EgnentroScan and then run temp EgnentroScan and follow the instructions displayed. Think of it as a general-purpose weirdness scanner. So what can it do? Well, SETI recorded the galactic anticenter in May of 2010 and again in October of 2010. Both observations, which are about 2 gigabytes of data, consist of boring Gaussian noise. But EgnentroScan can detect 10,000 samples of the former embedded in 2 billion samples of the latter. Have a look at this diagram here. So can we really find May noise in October noise? So as you can see, there are 2 SETI data files I used here. I'll give you an address in a moment where you can download them yourself. So file 0 was the galactic anticenter in October, and file 1 was exactly the same observation. The same megahertz, the same rate ascension, the same declination, everything the same, but in May. Well, okay, it wasn't exactly the same. I mean, even though the dish was aligned in precisely the same direction, the environment was, of course, somewhat different. EgnentroScan is so sensitive to such differences that it was able to find the 10,000 samples of May data buried in the middle of the 2 billion October samples. It was misaligned by just 5 out of these 10,000 samples. In this case, for the record, I'm counting one complex electric field measurement as 2 samples, which is 2 signed bytes. But the significance of this analysis goes well beyond signal detection. Hey, look, it's just entropy modulation. Yeah, seriously, you see, in 1900, De Moura and Fessenden gave us amplitude modulation, which is the AM in AM radio. Then in 1935, Armstrong gave us frequency modulation, as in FM radio. Now, we've just seen how a bit of information can be transmitted by altering the entropy of noise, as in that little 10,000 sample interlude can be thought of as a bit of data. This EM transmission method would be less susceptible to multipath and permeability problems which plague conventional and even ultra-wideband radio signaling. Now, perhaps we should consider implementing this technique in analog electronics for the sake of improving the analog basis for wireless digital communication. So there's a thought for the day. But for that matter, I suspect that ET may use entropy modulation precisely because of the signal robustness advantage that it should provide. But what if ET actually did that? I don't think we'd actually detect such a signal, even if we were lucky enough to intercept it. After all, it's more likely that we'd overhear a pair of ETs having a high-powered chat than that we detect a beacon directly targeting us. For confirmation of this theory, think about the total radio energy broadcast by technology over the entire course of history, as compared to the total energy broadcast from the Arecibo dish in a deliberate attempt to contact ET in the 1970s. Now, the Arecibo broadcast was very powerful, but its energy content was trivial by comparison. Now, you could argue that we'd actually be more likely to hear the beacon, but this is only true if you think in terms of sinusoidal power spectrum analysis. If, on the other hand, you can detect lots of anomalous photons arriving haphazardly over a long period of observation, then it seems more likely that we detect internal ET transitions not intended to be heard by us. But look, let's start with a boring sinusoidal carrier. So here's the SETI demo. Here's how to build it. It's the same story. Just download it, run make SETI demo, and then temp/SETI demo, and follow the instructions displayed. I pasted an example command line on this slide, along with the website where you can download the radio interference sample that I downloaded, and plus lots of others, so you can play with it yourself. Now, by the way, the SETI demo, to be clear, is testing different entropy transforms and their relative performance. The scan that I did to pick out the 10,000 samples, remember that was with EgnentroScan, which is another utility in the same Egnentro toolkit. So I just want to be clear about this. So, after a few hours, here is what SETI demo returns. It's just a list of entropy transform types and their associated hit rates. The greater the hex fraction, the more sensitive the entropy metric. As you can see, exoelasticity dominates everything else with respect to this particular signal detection exercise, but there are trade-offs of speed and accuracy to consider, of course, so you should just be aware of that. And by the way, why did it beat Fourier analysis? Now, after all, the injected signal is consistent with a perfect sinusoid, so Fourier should win. It doesn't because we took the first delta, that is the first discrete derivative of the signal to begin with. This cheap pre-processing step often enhances the sensitivity of entropy transforms. Let me show you what would have occurred had we not done that. Oh, and by the way, don't get lost in all the entropy transform names. They're all defined in the paper. Anyway, as you can see, when we disable deltification, Fourier does indeed win and ends up scoring higher than exoelasticity in the previous case. This is consistent with what we'd expect of a properly constructed experiment. Now, what kind of signal did we actually inject? Well, we started with a raw SETI data file from the web page that I gave you previously. We then isolated only channel 0 and discarded channel 1 just for the sake of simplicity. For each trial within the demo, we selected 16 million contiguous samples with a random base offset in the whole file, which is usually 2 gigabytes. Then we injected a square wave with amplitude 1 and period 2. In other words, we just increment sample n, decrement sample n plus 1, increment sample n plus 2, decrement sample n plus 3, etc. This is how a sine wave at the same amplitude and frequency would affect the data. Now, we always inject this signal into the end zone of the 16 million samples. The reason is that all the entropy transforms are very slightly biased to discover signals at the beginning of the file. This is, the beginning of the 16 million sample region. This is unavoidable for numerical reasons, so by putting the signal at the end, it makes it just that much harder to find by accident. So, what about that Fourier transform? Actually, it wasn't a Fourier transform. It was much more accurate than that. This so-called Fourier method simply involved a directed search for exactly the frequency and geometry of the injected wave. It's unrealistic. Real scientists tend to use fast Fourier transforms, and real ET signals don't magically align themselves to your sampling rate. So yeah, that factor of 3 sensitivity advantage over entropy does not exist in practice. Had we inserted enough random pauses in the signal, moreover, then no Fourier method would ever have found it, but some entropy transforms still would have. Now, but what if the data consists of floating point numbers? Well, Agnentro only deals in integers, signed or unsigned, of 1, 2, 3, or 4 bytes in size. Floats are not presently supported, but check out the section entitled Quantization and Entropy Contrast Optimization in the white paper. Oh, and by the way, don't use floats anyway. Floats result from processes which destroy information, whereas integers come directly from physical devices. So, how are we going to test all this? I don't know. We'll see what SETI has to say. Do you have a use for approximate searches or entropy searches? Try it yourself. Make science faster. And ask me. I'm here to help if I can. So my contact info is on the webpage if you'd like to chat. And by the way, Agnentro needs a nice user interface. Is anyone interested in maybe coding Agnentro Lab? If so, and there's no evidence of its existence on my webpage, then please contact me. Thanks for listening.